Inside Georgia State Prison, gangs and power struggles. The moment everything started to show. For years, what happened inside Georgia's prisons rarely made national headlines. Incidents occurred. Reports were filed. Investigations opened and closed. But for the most part, those events stayed contained, behind concrete walls, barbed wire, and layers of institutional silence. Then something changed. By the early 2020s, a pattern began to emerge. Not from a single prison, not from a single case, but across multiple facilities within the Georgia Department of Corrections. Reports of violence were no longer isolated. They were recurring. Inmates were being found with serious injuries, some in dormitories, some inside locked cells. In certain cases, deaths were reported under circumstances that required further investigation, sometimes labeled as suspicious, sometimes linked to confirmed assaults. Journalists, particularly from regional outlets like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, began tracking these incidents more closely. And what they found wasn't just a rise in violence. It was a system showing signs of strain. In 2023, dozens of inmate deaths were recorded across Georgia's prison system. Not all were homicides, but a significant number raised concerns about safety, supervision, and response times. At the same time, families began speaking publicly. Advocates began asking questions. And federal authorities began paying closer attention. Because under U.S. law, incarceration does not remove a person's constitutional protections. The state still has a responsibility to maintain order, a responsibility to protect, and a responsibility to ensure that punishment does not turn into unchecked harm. So when patterns like this begin to appear, they don't stay ignored for long.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
Inside Georgia State Prison, a system with history. To understand what's happening now, you have to understand where it's happening. Georgia State Prison, located in Reidsville, is one of the most established correctional facilities in the state. Opened in 1938, it has operated for decades as a central part of Georgia's prison system, housing individuals convicted of serious offenses and, at times, functioning as a high-security institution. Over the years, the facility has seen changes in leadership, policy, and inmate population. But like many long-standing prisons, its infrastructure reflects its age. And Georgia State Prison is not operating in isolation. It is part of a much larger network, the Georgia Department of Corrections, which oversees one of the largest prison populations in the United States. Tens of thousands of inmates, dozens of facilities. A system that requires constant coordination, staffing, and oversight to function effectively. And in recent years, that system has faced increasing pressure. Budget constraints, staff turnover, rising inmate populations in certain facilities. Each of these factors can affect how a prison operates on a daily basis. Because prisons are not static environments. They are constantly shifting. Every movement, meals, recreation, transfers, cell assignments, depends on structure. And when that structure weakens even slightly, the effects can spread. The staffing gap. One of the most consistently documented issues within Georgia's prison system is staffing. Correctional officers are the backbone of prison operations. They supervise inmate movement. They respond to emergencies. They enforce rules designed to maintain order. But according to multiple reports, including findings from the U.S. Department of Justice, staffing shortages have become a persistent challenge. In some facilities, officer vacancies have remained unfilled for extended periods. This means fewer officers assigned to monitor housing units, fewer patrols across large dormitory spaces, and in some cases, delayed responses when incidents occur. It's not just about numbers, it's about presence, because in correctional environments, visibility matters. An officer walking a tier, checking cells, observing interactions, can prevent conflicts before they escalate. But when that presence is reduced, small issues can grow unnoticed, and larger incidents can unfold more quickly than the system can respond. Reports have indicated that in certain areas, supervision has at times been stretched thin, not by choice but by necessity. And when oversight becomes limited, control doesn't disappear. It shifts. Contraband and communication. Inside any prison system, control depends heavily on restricting access. Access to movement, access to information, access to communication. But in Georgia's prisons, one of the most persistent challenges has been contraband. Items that are not supposed to be inside, but still find their way in. Among the most significant of these are cell phones. Unlike traditional prison phones, which are monitored and restricted, contraband cell phones allow unregulated communication with people outside, with other inmates, and in some cases, with networks that extend beyond prison walls. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and state investigators, have repeatedly identified contraband phones as a serious concern. Not because every device is used for criminal activity, but because the potential exists. And in documented cases, that potential has been realized. Investigations have linked some criminal operations, including fraud schemes and coordinated activities, to individuals operating from within prison using illicit communication devices. Officials have attempted multiple strategies to address this issue, including signal detection, increased searches, and policy changes. But the problem has proven difficult to eliminate completely, because contraband doesn't just enter through one channel, and once it circulates, it becomes part of an internal economy. An economy where access equals influence, gang presence and structure. Gangs are not new to correctional systems. Across the United States, various organized groups have existed inside prisons for decades. In Georgia, law enforcement agencies, including the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, have identified multiple gang affiliations among inmates. These groups can vary in size, structure, and level of organization. Some have connections outside prison. Others operate primarily within the facility. And not every inmate is affiliated. But in environments where resources are limited and supervision is stretched, organized groups can become more visible. According to investigative reporting and official findings, gangs can influence different aspects of prison life. This may include informal systems of protection, access to goods, or control over certain areas within a housing unit. However, it's important to be clear, not all activity is fully documented, and not all claims can be independently verified. Some accounts come from investigations, others from interviews or reports that describe patterns rather than specific, confirmed incidents. But across multiple sources, the presence of organized inmate groups has been acknowledged, and their influence has been a factor in ongoing federal scrutiny. When control becomes uncertain, a prison system does not lose control all at once. It happens gradually. A missed patrol here, a delayed response there, an area left unsupervised for just a little too long. Individually, these moments may seem minor, but over time they can add up. And when they do, they can create space. Space where unofficial systems begin to form. Not written down, not formally recognized, but understood by those inside. Reports and investigations into Georgia's prisons have suggested that in certain conditions, inmates may exert influence over daily routines, sometimes shaping how resources are distributed or how conflicts are handled. These dynamics are difficult to measure. They don't appear in official schedules. They're not always captured in incident reports, but their effects can still be observed in patterns of behavior, in repeated incidents, and in the growing attention from outside agencies trying to understand what's really happening inside. Because when a system designed for control begins to show gaps, the question is no longer just about safety. It becomes about authority. The federal response. Eventually, the pattern reached a point where federal action became unavoidable. The U.S. Department of Justice launched a civil rights investigation into Georgia's prison system under the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. The goal was not to examine a single incident, but to determine whether systemic issues were placing inmates at risk of harm. Investigators reviewed data across multiple facilities. They analyzed incident reports, staffing levels, and patterns of violence. And in 2024, the Department of Justice released findings that raised serious concerns. According to the report, conditions in Georgia's prisons may violate constitutional standards, specifically in relation to inmate safety. The findings pointed to multiple contributing factors: staffing shortages, widespread violence, and challenges in maintaining consistent control. The report did not claim that every facility was the same, nor did it suggest that every incident followed a single pattern. But it did confirm something critical: the issues were not isolated. They were systemic. By now the outline is clear. A system under pressure, staffing stretched thin, contraband circulating, organized groups present, and a federal investigation confirming that serious concerns exist. But this is only the surface. Because understanding what's happening inside Georgia State Prison means looking beyond reports and statistics. It means examining how power actually operates, day to day, cell to cell, dorm to dorm. Because inside these walls, authority isn't always defined by policy alone. Sometimes, it's defined by who can enforce it. How power operates behind the walls. Not just groups but structures. When people hear the word gang in a prison context, they often imagine something chaotic, unpredictable, disorganized. But in reality, many of the groups identified inside correctional systems across the United States, including Georgia, are structured. Not always formally documented, but structured enough to function. Law enforcement agencies, including the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, have reported that certain gangs operating within Georgia prisons maintain identifiable hierarchies. These hierarchies may include leaders, coordinators, and members with specific roles. In some cases, those roles extend beyond a single facility, particularly when individuals maintain connections outside prison walls. However, it's important to be precise. Not every inmate is affiliated, and not every facility experiences the same level of organization. But across multiple investigations and reports, the presence of structured groups has been consistently acknowledged. And structure changes everything. Because structure allows continuity. It allows communication. And in certain conditions, it allows influence to persist, even in environments designed to restrict it. Documented cases of coordination. Over the years, multiple investigations have revealed instances where criminal activity was coordinated from inside prison facilities. Some of the most documented cases involve contraband cell phones. According to federal and state law enforcement reports, these devices have been used in certain instances to organize activities outside prison walls, including fraud schemes and other coordinated operations. For example, in several publicly reported cases, inmates were linked to scams targeting individuals outside the prison system. These cases were investigated and, in some instances, prosecuted. It's important to emphasize, these are not everyday occurrences for every inmate. They represent specific, documented cases. But they demonstrate something critical. That under certain conditions, communication restrictions can be bypassed. And when that happens, the physical boundaries of a prison become less absolute. Because influence is no longer confined to the facility itself. Control of resources. Inside prison, access matters. Access to food beyond standard meals. Access to hygiene products. Access to communication. Most of these come through official channels, like the commissary system. But in environments where contraband exists, a parallel economy can develop. This economy is not formally recognized, but it has been described in multiple investigations and reports. Items such as food, clothing, or contraband goods can circulate between inmates. And in some cases, access to these items can be influenced by informal systems, including group affiliations. This does not mean that every transaction is controlled, or that every inmate participates. But it does mean that in certain conditions, resources can become tied to influence. And influence can translate into power. Violence as enforcement. In any system, formal or informal, rules require enforcement. Within official prison operations, that enforcement comes from correctional staff. Policies are written. Procedures are followed. But in environments where oversight is limited, informal enforcement can emerge. According to federal findings and investigative reporting, some incidents of violence within Georgia prisons may be linked to disputes over control, access, or internal conflicts. Not every act of violence is organized. Many incidents are spontaneous, personal, or unrelated to group activity. But some patterns have raised concern among investigators, particularly when similar types of incidents occur repeatedly across different facilities. The Department of Justice report noted that violence in Georgia's prison system is not only present, but, in some areas, persistent. And in systems where violence becomes a recurring factor, it can begin to shape behavior. It can influence decisions. And it can reinforce existing power structures. Limits of oversight. Monitoring a prison is not simple. Facilities are large. Populations are dense. And movement is constant. Surveillance systems, including cameras and patrols, are designed to provide oversight. But they are not always comprehensive. There are blind spots. There are delays. And in understaffed environments, there may not always be enough personnel to respond immediately to every situation. According to investigative findings, some incidents in Georgia prisons occurred in areas where supervision was limited at the time. Others were discovered after the fact. This does not mean that oversight is absent, but it does highlight its limitations. Because even with systems in place, coverage is never perfect. And when gaps exist, they can be used. Different facilities, different conditions. It's important to understand that not all Georgia prisons operate the same way. Conditions can vary significantly from one facility to another. Security levels differ. Staffing levels differ. And the layout of each prison, whether it uses dormitory-style housing or individual cells, can influence how interactions occur. Some facilities maintain tighter control with more structured movement. Others, particularly those with larger dormitory settings, may require broader supervision strategies. The Department of Justice findings did not describe a single uniform condition across all prisons. Instead, they pointed to systemic issues that manifest differently depending on the environment, which means that while patterns exist, their intensity and visibility can vary. The role of fear and uncertainty. Beyond structure and statistics, there is another factor that is harder to measure: perception. In environments where violence is reported and where control is questioned, perception can shape behavior as much as reality. Some inmates may choose to align with groups for protection. Others may avoid interaction altogether. And many simply try to navigate the system as quietly as possible. Reports and interviews conducted by journalists have described environments where uncertainty plays a role in daily life, where the question is not just what is happening, but what might happen. And in systems under scrutiny, that uncertainty becomes part of the story. Up to this point, everything we've examined exists inside the walls. Internal structures, internal conflicts, internal systems of influence. But prisons do not exist in isolation. They are connected to communities, to law enforcement, and, in some cases, to networks that extend beyond the facility itself. Because when communication crosses those walls, so can impact. And that's where the story expands. If you made it this far, you've seen the full picture. Not just headlines, but the reality behind the walls. This isn't just about one prison. It's about a system under pressure, and the question of who truly holds control when that pressure builds. If you found this documentary informative, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we break down real, verified stories from inside the world most people never see. And if there's a case or prison you think we should cover next, drop it in the comments. Until next time, stay informed.